There's a man who bought a Porsche last year, not with savings, not with a bonus, and not with a kind of debt that destroys people quietly over time. The people around him have a theory. He got lucky. Maybe a windfall. Maybe family money. Maybe a loan he probably shouldn't have taken. But they're wrong. Because the Porsche didn't really come from his paycheck. It came from a system. And that system is the real difference between people who look rich and people who stay rich. Most people use money in a straight line. Work, get paid, pay taxes, spend what's left. Repeat. That model can keep life moving, but it usually does not build serious wealth. And the real gap is not just income, it's psychology. Because most people don't lose financially because they're stupid. They lose because they're human. They want the reward now. They want to feel successful now. They want the visible win now. And wealthy people, or at least disciplined ones, often learn how to interrupt those instincts. That's what this video is really about. Not just 5 buying strategies, but the psychology underneath them. Because the wealthy don't just ask, "Can I afford this?" They ask, "What structure lets me own this?" Without weakening the machine that makes me wealthy. That shift changes everything, and it starts with strategy number 1. 1. Buy assets first, lifestyle second. Most people buy things with money they earned. Wealthy people often try to buy things with money their assets produced. That is a completely different mindset. The average buyer says, "I want the car. How long will it take me to save up?" The asset-first buyer asks, "What do I need to own first, so this purchase doesn't actually hurt me?" That question alone changes your financial life, because most people are fighting a very basic psychological force, present bias. The brain overvalues what feels good now and undervalues what pays off later. That is why luxury feels powerful and compounding feels boring. A car gives you emotion today. An asset gives you optionality later. Most people choose emotion, and then they call it a financial decision. There's another trap here too. Hedonic adaptation. In plain English, what feels exciting now starts feeling normal faster than people think. So people stretch financially for the car, the watch, the apartment, the lifestyle. And a few months later, it just feels normal. The thrill fades, but the cost remains. That is why wealthy people often try to build the engine first. Because if you spend the capital, it's gone. But if you build productive assets first, those assets may create income, appreciation, or borrowing power later. Not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed. Markets fall, assets fluctuate, bad investments exist. But the principle is still simple. Don't consume the engine. Build the engine first. And once the engine exists, the next strategy starts to make sense. 2. Borrow without selling. This is where things start to sound unfair. Most people hear the word debt and think, danger. And sometimes they're right. But sophisticated investors don't use debt the same way consumers do. Consumers often use debt to buy things they cannot really afford. Wealthy borrowers often use debt to access liquidity without killing the asset underneath. That matters, because if you sell an appreciated asset, you may interrupt compounding, you may trigger taxes, and you may lose future upside. But if you borrow against that asset instead, you may be able to access cash while keeping the investment in place. That is a huge psychological shift, because average people evaluate debt emotionally. They ask, "Does this make me feel stressed?" Sophisticated investors ask, "Does this preserve the stronger long-term position?" That is not the same question, and it connects to another psychological principle, loss aversion. People hate losing, but they often misunderstand where the real loss is. Sometimes selling feels safe, clean, comforting. But what feels emotionally safe in the moment can be strategically expensive over time. Now, important. This is also where people get burned, because leverage is not magic. If the asset falls, if cash flow weakens, if the loan is too aggressive, this strategy can become a disaster. So the lesson is not, debt is good. The lesson is, debt is a tool, and tools are dangerous in weak hands. Used carefully, debt can protect momentum. Used badly, it destroys people. That brings us to strategy number 3, and this is where a lot of people start lying to themselves. 3. Use the tax code the way businesses do. This is where people hear one phrase, write off, and immediately lose all discipline. Suddenly, everything becomes a business expense. Dinner, trips, cars, random upgrades they were going to buy anyway. That is not strategy, that is fantasy. Yes, the tax code often gives businesses more flexibility than employees, but only when the expense is real, necessary, legitimate, documented. That's the line. Not personal spending disguised as intelligence, actual business use. And the psychology here matters more than people think. Because most people don't make bad money decisions through logic, they make them through rationalization. They want something first. Then they build a story around why it was smart. That is incredibly common. Undisciplined people ask after the purchase, "How do I justify this?" Disciplined operators ask before the purchase, "Is this truly productive?" That one difference saves people years of financial damage. Because yes, structure matters. A real business expense can be treated very differently from a personal purchase made with post-tax income. But the wealthy are usually not winning because they cheat. They're winning because they understand the rules, respect the rules, and structure around the rules. That is a very different thing. And once you understand that, you start seeing money differently. You stop asking only, "What does this cost?" and start asking, "What category is this in? What does this do to after-tax cash flow? Does this produce or just impress?" And that leads to strategy number 4. 4. Use equity like stored financial power. Most people think of real estate as a home. Wealthier buyers often think of it as a balance sheet. Because real estate can do more than give you a place to live. It can build equity. And equity, if used carefully, can become leverage. That is where the game changes. A property rises in value. The loan balance slowly drops. Equity builds quietly in the background. Most people stop there. They look at the number, they feel richer, and that's it. But sophisticated buyers ask a different question. Can this equity help me acquire the next asset without forcing me to sell the first one? That is a much more strategic way to think. And psychologically, this is about mental accounting. People treat money differently depending on where it sits. Salary feels spendable. Home equity feels untouchable. Investment gains feel abstract. Borrowed money feels scary. Wealth builders often think in function, not in labels. They ask, what can this capital do? That is why tools like refinancing or home equity access can become powerful. Not because they are free money, they are not, but because they can turn passive equity into active financial capacity. Again, used badly, this can go wrong fast. If rates rise, if income drops, if the original deal was weak, the numbers will expose everything. So this is not about recklessness, it is about control. Selling turns the asset into cash. Leveraging can turn one asset into another. And that brings us to the 5th strategy. This is the one that sounds fake the first time you hear it. 5. Get your money back while still owning the asset. This is where the whole thing becomes counterintuitive. An investor puts money into a deal. The asset rises in value. The loan balance drops. Cash flow improves. And later, they refinance. Now here's the part most people never forget once they understand it. They may be able to pull out some, sometimes all, of the original capital, while still owning the asset. Think about how strange that sounds to the average person. The property stays, the income may continue, and the original cash can potentially be reused somewhere else. That's why some investors call this an infinite return model. Not because it's risk-free, not because it's magical, and definitely not because every deal works, but because the original money is no longer trapped. It got recycled. And this may be the deepest psychological divide of all. Most people feel better when money is sitting still. Wealth builders care more about whether money is still working. That is a radically different relationship with capital. One mindset says, my money is inside the asset, so I feel secure. The other says, if the asset still performs, why should my capital stay trapped there? That is not greed. That is capital efficiency. And that idea sits underneath all 5 strategies. The wealthy don't just ask, can I buy this? They ask, what structure lets me own this without weakening the machine that builds wealth? That is the difference. Now, to be clear, not every wealthy person uses all 5 strategies. Not every luxury purchase is funded this way. And none of this works without patience, discipline, and margin for error. But once you understand the psychology underneath wealth, You start seeing spending differently. You start noticing how often people buy to relieve emotion, to feel successful, to signal status, to reward themselves early, to look rich in public, while quietly weakening themselves in private. And then you start seeing the alternative. A luxury purchase stops looking like the starting point. It starts looking like the byproduct, the output of a system, the result of a machine, not the goal itself. That Porsche was never really the story. The story was the financial machine behind it, and the psychology behind the machine. Because people who stay rich usually are not just making more money. They are managing impulse better, they are delaying reward better, they are structuring purchases better, and they are far less interested in looking rich today if it makes them weaker tomorrow. And once you really see that, it becomes very hard to go back to the old way of thinking.